All right, so the next section we're going to talk about is white terrorism and lynching. This is something that started. This was a form of control, during slavery, but continued after slavery, continued, way up into, to this day. I mean, we're still experiencing forms of white terrorism. Even last night there was, protests. Occurring, against police brutality, and a white gunman, shot and killed. I think killed one, or I think he shot three protesters with an assault rifle, and then definitely killed one. And that's something that's just it's happening till this day. So it is a great cartoon that kind of captures, to basically how the overthrow of Reconstruction, and how KKK and the White League and white terrorism was some of the main forces responsible for overthrowing Reconstruction. So I'm gonna play another equal justice initiative about terror lynching. We're gonna play a couple different videos from them, all short videos, but they're like one of the leading voices around lynching, and the historic legacy of lynching in this country.
After slavery was prohibited in 1865, formerly enslaved people in America were granted full citizenship, the right to vote, and under the 14th Amendment, protection from racial violence. Formerly enslaved people were promised land and opportunity, but most got nothing because America quickly devolved into an era of racial terrorism and oppression for Black citizens. White people in the South were angry that people formerly considered property were now equal citizens. Many turned to violence. In the years immediately following the Civil War, thousands of Black people were murdered when they tried to claim their rights. Soon afterwards, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, ending a brief period of racial progress known as Reconstruction. Nationwide resistance to racial equality resulted in the reestablishment of racial subordination through biased laws, disenfranchisement, and terrorism, most dramatically enforced through lynchings. Racial terror lynchings of Black people defined a shameful era in America. These lynchings differed from the hanging of white people in places where there was no functioning criminal justice system. Racial terror lynchings were directed at all Black people. They enforced compliance with racial hierarchy and white supremacy, and ensured racial segregation and denial of equal rights. In 1916, in Cedar Bluff, Mississippi, a young Black man named Jeff Brown accidentally bumped into a white woman while running to catch a train. A white mob stopped him and lynched him, beating him and then hanging him from a tree for his insolence and carelessness. His public murder was not about criminal punishment, but was instead about maintaining racial hierarchy and terrorizing the Black community. White town residents proudly sold photographs of Mr. Brown's brutalized body hanging from the tree for 5 cents each. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented thousands of racial terror lynchings between 1877 and 1950. EJI has confirmed the lynchings of over 4,000 Black people who were tortured, maimed, beaten, shot, hung, and burned alive by crowds of white people, often with the cooperation of law enforcement or government officials. The terror of lynching was so widespread that millions of Black people fled the South and settled in the urban North and West as refugees of American terror, shaping the current demographic geography of the United States. On July 5th, 1933, an older Black woman named Elizabeth Lawrence reprimanded a group of white children who threw rocks at her as she walked home from work. Word spread that a Black woman had dared to rebuke white children, and that night, an angry mob of white citizens lynched Ms. Lawrence for her audacity. Her home was then burned to the ground. Her son, Alexander, fled to Boston. Racial terror lynchings often had the atmosphere of carnivals, with food vendors and souvenir stands. Hundreds or thousands of white people would often gather to watch and take part in the torture and murder of Black citizens. There has been no effort in America to confront this legacy of racial terror. While hundreds of Confederate monuments litter the landscape in southern states, there has been no public recognition of the violence endured by Black people. On October 7, 1910, a white mob in Montgomery, Alabama tried to abduct and lynch Black men being held in jail on suspicion of miscegenation, or interracial sexual relations. When they were unable to get the men out of the jail, the frustrated mob lynched a black taxi driver named John Dell, who was sitting in his cab nearby. No one was ever arrested or prosecuted for his murder. EJI's Community Remembrance Project collects soil from the many sites where terror lynchings occurred. Jars labeled with the names of murdered Black citizens are on public display at EJI, a powerful visual reminder of history we must face. EJI is working to create a permanent memorial to honor victims of lynching, a place to reflect on America's history of racial violence. We hope to place historical markers at hundreds of lynching sites around the country. Contemporary issues like police violence, excessive punishment in the criminal justice system, and even harsh and punitive treatment of children of color in schools and on streets cannot be understood without a deeper examination into our history of racial violence. More truthful discourse and reflection on our history of racial injustice is essential for us to achieve racial equity. Confronting the legacy of lynching is critical to advancing this conversation. We hope you will join our effort to help towns, cities, and states confront and recover from these tragic histories of racial violence through truth and reconciliation, where there can truly be equal justice for all.
All right. So to talk about white terrorism, we really need to go back to the slave period. Violence and the threat of violence. There was so many at times, especially in 1860, there was 4 million enslaved, people at the time, and a lot of people ask, well, how are these people, controlled? Why? There was a lot of rebellions. There was a lot of slave rebellions as well, but I mean, for the most part, most of these people were controlled and enslaved, and a lot of that had to do with the violence and in terrorism as well. So the treatment of enslaved people in the U.S. So people, it was fear that kept many people in this position. There was torture, there was an enormous amount of mutilation and branding, sexual abuse and rape. Rachel Feinstein writes, rape was not merely a result of sexual desire and opportunity or simply a form of punishment and racial domination, but instead encompassed all these dimensions as part of an identity of white masculinity. And there was this constant fear of just having your family separated and have your children separated and sold to different farms as a form of punishment. So there was this ongoing fear that really and torture that kept a lot of people enslaved. And then there was even like this, running away was something that was super dangerous, because there was this constant, some of our first police, officers were slave patrols in the South. This is a badge of was very similar to, many badges that we see today of a North Carolina slave patrol. And these patrols, first one started in 1704 in the colony of Carolina, but were developed over time. And mainly most white people, in the neighborhoods were forced to be part of these slave patrols, and they had, mainly free reign to do what they want with any, slaves running away. So it was an enormous amount of fear and enormous amount of violence that really kept people, controlled the institutions of slavery. So Turner writes, a legally sanctioned law enforcement system existed in America before the Civil War for the express purpose of controlling the slave population and protecting interests of slave owners. But then after the Civil War, we start seeing kind of this rise of this fear and this terrorism continued. But these slave patrols went away and kind of transformed into in many ways they transformed into the modern police and sheriffs that we saw throughout the the next century or so. But a lot of them became these vigilante groups. So you had the secret group, you had publicly open groups and then secret groups as well. But the secret groups were the KKK, Ku Klux Klan, was founded by the Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who actually has a lot of monuments in this country, and then also Tennessee established the Nathan Bedford Ford Day last year. So he still gets a lot of credit, even though he's literally a founder of the KKK. and then you have Knights of a White Camellia, and so a lot of these in these secret organizations, that's where we see the mask and everything, because people wanted to terrorize people more for their secrecy. But then you also had a lot of publicly open groups like the White League and Red Shirts, where these publicly open terrorist groups that would commit throughout the Reconstruction period and the next century after Civil War, committed all kinds of massacres that we're going to talk about. And a lot of the goal of these early groups was essentially to bring back the Democrat Party, bring back the Confederates back in power, to bring back white, supremacy. So a big goal of this, the terrorism, was focused on Black people and Republican voters, trying to suppress the vote through intimidation and violence and terrorism and lynching. So they supported what was called a redemption movement, or redeemers. With this, again, there was this myth that Black people and Republicans were terrible at ruling this country, the South, after the Civil War during radical Reconstruction, and they're like a form of, and then white people were actually the victims, and these terrorists were trying to redeem, the South and kind of save the white people by any means necessary, which included all kinds of terrorism and acts of violence to prevent Black people from voting and ultimately allow white the old Confederate governments to come back. So they use this again. This is where we really start seeing the expansion of this Black criminality mythology, of this idea that all Black people were violent and they're rapists, and that they needed violence to be controlled. They needed violence through the KKK, through the vigilante groups, through through police, sheriffs, through the state violence. They needed violence to actually be controlled and to save white people, particularly white women. A lot of this, like lynching, and they would push these ideas that Black people were, if it wasn't for this violence, Black people would be raping women. So they had, and white women were particularly, we saw this mixture of patriarchy and white supremacy, where we created white women as this like it was tangible form of white supremacy. It represented whiteness and white supremacy. So white women had to, any threat to white women or perceived threat had to be met with violence, and oftentimes these perceived threats were made up, which instigated a lot of violence. So I'm going to read this quote. As slaves, Black men were narrative as docile and generally subservient. As free people, however, the ideology of docility was replaced with a mystique of danger. During Reconstruction, white mainstream voices argued that Black men whose predatory proclivities had allegedly been benevolently suppressed under slavery would revert to their natural state of violence and criminality. Thus, the ideology of the Black brute was birthed. So this idea that slavery controlled Black people, it was like the structure that controlled their natural criminality, their natural Black bruteness. But once slavery was done, and then they were set loose onto white people. And so the mythology is that they needed all this violence to redeem and to protect white people. And that's where we start seeing this emergence of what we call racial terror lynchings. So it's important to kind of distinguish. The idea of these lynchings, like lynchings in itself, is anytime white people, or anytime any group of people decide to basically take decide to administer justice outside of the legal framework, so outside of court systems and the criminal justice systems. But what made racial terror lynchings, it's important to recognize is this is a whole new form of lynchings that wasn't just about justice. It was ultimately about enforcing terrorism on Black communities with the hope of keeping Black communities keeping them, subservient and forcing them into sharecropping and continuing to be that exploited labor that created wealth for white people. So Equal Justice Initiative wrote that the act and threat of lynching became primarily a technique of enforcing racial exploitation, economic, political, and cultural. So some of these, some of the characteristics of this, these public acts and violence were often, the main goal was not just to terrorize the person that they're killing, but also terrorize whole communities. communities of Black people. So they knew this is what was going to happen if you try to, stand up for yourself, or you try to leave, sharecropping, or sharecropping, or if you try to organize a union, or if you try to migrate to the north, this is what's going to happen to you. So it was meant to, terrorize these Black communities. It was meant to enforce white supremacy and particularly racial segregation. That was a big part. Anytime Black people would kind of cross the line on racial segregation, that was a big form of the white lash that would occur. And all these things, a lot of these, was done, in the middle, in the woods, away from public, but a lot of times they were done as these like big community events. And they would be, like literally there would be like hundreds of community members coming out, and they would be like picnics and drinks, and food would be served as they were literally torturing these Black people to death. And then they would take postcards. These are literal postcards they would take pictures of, and then it just became this, like, it was just this form of dehumanization, as well as this form of terrorizing and controlling Black communities. So it's very similar with slavery, how torture and violence and terrorism was used to control enslaved people. The same techniques were used to control free Black people, and it profoundly it shaped race relations and political, social, economic conditions of Black people. This was lynching. Lynched, thousands of Black people were lynched, over a good century. And this really is one of the founding moments of where we find ourselves today. I mean, it's how, demographically speaking, majority of Black people were escaped the South. We whitewash this as a great migration, like they're just, just migrating, looking for more economic opportunity, but they're fleeing, terrorism, and fleeing the systems that terrorism was forcing them into. So it really shaped the demographics of our country, and it also shaped, it fueled, because the justifications, because they couldn't just, say, hey, we're just, torturing a bunch of Black people so we can continue to make a whole bunch of money off of them. Instead, when these things came out, they would be like, we had to do this. These Black people were out of control. They're criminals, and they're just naturally inclined to criminality, and we had to do this to protect our, our white people and our white women. So this helped shape these Black criminality myths that was spread all around this, throughout this country, from even like white communities that never really experienced Black people. All of a sudden, they're Black people are arriving from trying to escape this terrorism, and they treat them as the same Black criminality, and they force them into horrific, poverty and racially segregated poverty, and that's enforced by a racial hierarchy that's enforced by police and police violence. It really, and this is, we're still seeing to this day as well. And lynching really created a legacy of racial inequalities and trauma as well. And we don't talk about this. Instead, we a lot of places where a lot of these horrible lynchings and massacres happen, we see Confederate monuments, and we completely whitewash this history to the point where if you don't know this history, you can't really understand what's happening today with this massive protests against police brutality and white supremacy. So American Experience writes, lynching, an act of terror meant to spread fear among Blacks, served the broad social purpose of maintaining white supremacy in economic, social, and political spheres. So I'm playing Bryan Stevenson, Lynching in America. What is a racial terror lynching? So he does a bunch of little 1-minute videos that we're going to play throughout this section.
People hear the word lynching and they think it means a hanging, but that's not what we're talking about. Racial terror lynchings are violence, lethal violence, directed at people because of their race in an effort to terrorize the entire community. Racial terror lynching is a particular kind of violence that emerges as Reconstruction collapses following the Civil War. People in the South did not believe that enslaved people, Black people, were equal. They thought they were less than human. They were subordinate, less than deserving of the rights that the new Constitution provided them. And so they began to use violence to create a system of racial hierarchy that crimes, if you will, that Black people could be accused of were often not crimes at all. Passing a note to a white woman, not stepping off the sidewalk, laughing, not calling a white person sir or mister. These social transgressions got many African Americans killed. This violence was not directed just at the person who was murdered. It was directed at the entire African American community. It was terrorism. And for us to recover from that violence, from that terrorism, we all have to know it, and we have to deal with it, we have to address it, we have to talk about it.
All right. So it's just some basic facts around generally the lynching period went from, directly after the return of white supremacy, 1877, after essentially, after the military was removed. So Rutherford B. Hayes can be, we talked about the Great Compromise in the last, in the Reconstruction section, where it was basically close to a tie, and it was, and they're trying to figure out, who was going to become president, and the Democrats, at the time were like, you can have a presidency if you remove the military from from the South, which was basically the only thing keeping the Reconstruction period happening, and they agreed to that, and the military was removed, and then at that point it was just free reign of lynching and white terrorism, and there was nothing that was protecting Black people for the next century in the South. So a lot of the facts that we have mainly comes from two sources. One, Ida B. Hayes, we'll talk about, and she did that kind of the first studies on capturing data around lynching, and then the Equal Justice Initiative, Bryan Stevenson, they did an enormous amount of research as well. And honestly, I'm sure that other people as well has contributed, but this is a history that would, without a handful of people, would have been, lost completely from us. But they found, at least 4,400 people during this time period were lynched across 800 U.S. counties, and all except 300 were in the South. So a lot of this, lynching occurred in the West as well, California, Texas. A lot of Latinx people were lynched. A lot of Asian American immigrants were lynched. Indigenous, people were lynched. Those are a little bit harder to kind of distinguish between, was this just direct violence or lynching as well. But they did capture that. But majority of people were lynched, or at least recorded lynched. We know there's way more people that were lynched that have never been recorded. But the majority of people that were recorded, at least, who were lynched, happening in the South. And that includes, torture, burning, shooting, castrations, dismemberment, hanging, all different kinds of forms of torture and murder. And most, so most people lynched in the South were Black men, but there was also women and children were also lynched as well as, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, even Jewish, Irish, and Italians were also lynched as well in much smaller numbers. Some of the common reasons, oftentimes, they always claim that, it was a Black, it was a criminal, and he had done a crime, and they wanted, justice. They wanted mob justice, basically, not, so that's the primarily excuse for a lot of it. A lot of it, was centered around, like, protecting white women, like supposedly a Black person did something to affront or assault a white woman. But that, these two things were often made up, basically, to perpetuate it. And maybe, a lot of people that were doing the lynching may have believed this. Maybe it was politicians and newspapers that sold these lies that, these people did something. But most of the times, these Black people, they did not commit a crime, or, they committed something that wasn't a crime. Like, there was a lot of people who got lynched for having consensual interracial relationships. So if, but at that time, white people couldn't handle that, so they assumed the Black person was raping the white woman, so they would lynch them. But Ida B. Wells, I think I said Ida B. Hayes in the last slide. It's Ida B. Wells. I'm sorry. She wrote, and Southern Horrors is one of the first investigations on lynching that was done, that she carried out. She wrote, "Southern white men were shielding themselves behind this plausible screen of defending the honor of their women through lynchings in order to palliate their record of hate and violence." So she found out that most of the times, even when they said it was about a white woman, it was just all made up, and there wasn't usually never any encounter with that white woman. Same with Emmett Till. Emmett Till was lynched, and they claimed it's because he was rude to a white woman, and we found out, many years later that a white woman just made that whole story up. But real reality is most of this happened because it was, one, it was either consensual interracial relationships, or it was just because of casual social transgressions. A lot of times it was just, to enforce white supremacy. It was just about, a black person, maybe went in the wrong door, went in the white door, or refused to, do something, or looked at a white woman, or walked, did something that offended the racial hierarchy. Oftentimes it did not take that much at all for these people to be lynched. But because it wasn't about, punishment for that one person. It was about instilling this racial hierarchy through terrorism. So a lot of times also it was about, scapegoating, economic situations. A lot of Latinx, a lot of Mexican immigrants were lynched because they were blamed on certain, economic, situations. And so a lot of black businesses were lynched too, because they were competing too much with white businesses as well. But the main goals of this was just intimidating black people, particularly around Reconstruction. It was about intimidating black voters and civil rights activists, and any black person kind of standing up. So ultimately, lynching was used to ensure white supremacy, ensure this racial hierarchy. And a lot of times, a lot of people were lynched because they were just, the wrong person. There was just a black person in the wrong place. A lot of times, white mobs would be looking for certain people and couldn't find them, so then they just lynched random black people. And a lot of times this was created through, this hysteria was created through newspapers and politicians. A lot of people lynching, maybe they felt like these people were actual criminals, and they actually had to because these newspapers would sensationalize its political leaders. The Democrats, at the time, the Redeemers would talk about how all black people were rapists and criminals, and would push these ideologies to the point that these mobs would naturally occur, and take matters in their own hands. So there'd be newspaper stories and stump speeches warned of black beasts who threatened the flower of Southern white womanhood. So and this was what happened in Wilmington massacre. We'll talk about that in a little bit in a second. But that was essentially it was these newspapers that were presenting these pushing these ideas that these black people were black beasts, and we had to protect them, our white women, from them. And then politicians were added to that, and eventually just the mobs occurred on their own. So the highest rates of lynchings like Mississippi, Florida, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, but for sure Mississippi was most black people were lynched in Mississippi. It's had some of the highest ranks. And then there's types of lynchings. I don't want to get too much into this. The details of a lot of these stories. I feel like sometimes it's a gray line between talking about this history and sensationalizing this as well. So I'm just going to put up some of these names and encourage people to kind of do their own research. And also I want to respect if you've had trauma around these kinds of violence, it's pretty hard to read. So you may need to read this on your own time. But I encourage everyone to read these these cases and read about them. Particularly like the Equal Justice Initiative did this really fantastic report. It's not too long. It's like maybe 20 pages, but it covers all these different kinds of lynchings. But one Emmett Till was this I think I forget his age. I think it was like 14 or something like that. He went down, he lived in the north, went down to the south to visit some relatives, supposedly, hit on a white woman, supposedly, a white woman. Actually, we found out later that she made up that whole encounter, and he was lynched horrifically. And then there was actually a sign honoring him, and that sign is shot up. Like they have to replace it every year. We have to replace it to this day with a new sign that signs in the area where he was actually lynched. And I mean, that's how it's legacy of lynching, where we still, white people still see these people as these like criminals, and white people were just doing what they needed to protect themselves. There was, so there was just straight up murder, but there was lynching, but there's also public torture, spectacles, the lynching of Luther Holbert, where they basically, I mean, look at the size of this crowd, all came out to see this black guy tortured to death. A lot of it eliminating economic competition. There was this People's Grocery store owned by black people that were actually out competing some local white grocery stores. So, they had to be lynched and things were burned down. Probably one of the most horrific stories was Mary Turner. Her husband was lynched. Well, basically, I mean, it was one of those lynching rampages where they were looking for this. A sharecropper actually shot a really abusive farm owner, white farm owner. So there was this whole mob looking for this guy, and they couldn't find him. So they just lynched every black person they could. And one of them was Mary Turner's husband. And then she came and tried to, complain about it, and she was lynched as well, including, she had a baby, inside her stomach, and it's just a horrific story. I'll let you all kind of read on your own on that one. But I mean, to really understand the mentality, definitely need to read about Mary Turner. And then Asian, Mexican, and Native American lynchings happened, all throughout the West. A big part of it was Texas Rangers. We glorified. We had this whole show with Chuck Norris about Texas Rangers. Texas Rangers was a terrorist group. I mean, they were sponsored, loosely sponsored by the government, but I mean, they performed. I mean, they did not, really go with they didn't work with inside the laws. I mean, they performed most of their lynching themselves instead of taking people back to, courts and stuff. And a lot of their lynching occurred because they actually wanted the land of these Mexican people. And a lot of them, and I say Mexican, but I mean, most of these people were American citizens that just, after the Mexican-American War, found themselves, they used to be Mexican immigrants, but then we won all this territory through this war that we forced on, and then now all of a sudden they were American citizens. And we promised to, we'll talk more about this in another class, but we promised to, protect them and give them equal rights, but eventually we forced them off most of their land. So for white settlers. So, on top of that, lynchings, we also had a lot of massacres, or what we call pogroms. So these are happened all throughout the, starting immediately after the Civil War. We start seeing these big massacres of black people. Oftentimes it was centered around black voters or black, governments. But immediately we start seeing these Memphis massacre, New Orleans massacres. These are big massacres that actually, when word got out from the North, actually, and galvanized enough people in the North to actually vote for radical Republicans, giving them the majority in 1866, and then they were able to, initiate radical Reconstruction based on that for the next decade. But these happened all over the country, and we don't talk about this at all. We don't have markers for most of these things. We don't, a lot of these massacres are completely whitewashed, and particularly, this happened especially in the Red Summer of 1919. And just in that summer alone, we had dozens of what we call, we have to be careful because a lot of times people call them race riots, and that's very intentional because that tries to make it seem like there's two groups fighting each other. I mean, these were anti-black, massacres or anti-black riots where hundreds of people, and in all of these, cases, hundreds of black people were massacred, and oftentimes like rape and torture as well. But in this summer, over 3 dozen, cities, all were massacred. Had these massacres occur. And a lot of this was centered around, it was after the Great Migration. A lot of black people were leaving a lot of cities and or leaving the South and coming to these urban areas for jobs. There's a need for jobs during the World War I in a lot of these factories, and then particularly after World War I was over, there was a lot of competition against like jobs and housing, and there was a lot of black soldiers as well that were returning, particularly to the South, and they had felt like that, because they had put, so many of them died fighting in this war, that they deserved rights at this point, and a lot of them were lynched just because they didn't follow Jim Crow or spoke up, And then, like, in Lane, Arkansas, there's this huge massacre of just black sharecroppers. They all gathered into this building to organize in a union, to try to fight for better wages, and a big mob surrounded them and killed over 200 of them. These are, we got whole classes on every one of these massacres. They're horrific, and like, thousands of black people died, and not only that, but their homes were burned, and thousands of homes. Tulsa was the biggest one. There was that HBO show. I already forgot the name of it, but the opening scene was this massacre in Tulsa, and no, like, most white people watching it had no idea that even happened. Up to basically, we'll show a video about that Tulsa in a second. But it was basically this thriving black community, what we call Black Wall Street. And then there was just there's this like made up encounter between a black person and a white woman that allowed this white mob to basically just kill hundreds of black people and destroy over thousands of homes, and millions of dollars of wealth was lost. And then there was this huge effort to cover it all up, and a very similar situation with Rosedale as well. So Kimberly Latrice Jones gave this great speech after the riots in Minneapolis after George Floyd, and she talked about a lot of these things. She said every time that they don't like the way that we're playing, or that they're catching you're catching up, or that you're doing something to be self-sufficient, they burn your game. So if I play 400 rounds of Monopoly and I had to give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and they did in Rosedale. And how can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. They are lucky that what black people are looking for is quality and not revenge. So she talks about how, like, every time there's a successful community in Wilmington and Tulsa and Rosewood and all these black communities that were thriving, white mobs would basically destroy them. They would burn all the homes and massacre people, and then they were forced to flee and find other places to live. And it's just occurred over and over and over again. And it's just insane that we don't talk about any of this in our history books in our schools. So a big one I want to talk about is Colfax massacre, because that had some really horrific ramifications with the Supreme Court as well. But basically, in Colfax, in 1872, this was during Reconstruction. Democrat candidates, essentially, it was widely understood that they through using voter suppression, they stole the election in Colfax, Louisiana. So black protesters, protested, and they staged a peaceful occupation of the town courthouse, and then a white militia group of 300 came in and basically surrounded the courthouse and just massacred everyone. Executed many of them, killed many of them, and it was just, they call it the bloodiest single act of carnage in all of Reconstruction. And to this day, this is an example of how we teach this. There's no signs, saying, there's no signs, honoring or recognizing it as a black massacre. There's signs, basically saying that, honoring this as a they honored. There's 3 white people that died trying to, just kill everyone, and they have signs honoring those 3 people. This event on this April 13th, 1873, marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. Or this is a monument erected in memory of the heroes who fell in the Colfax riot fighting for white supremacy. So they literally, instead of having monuments, honoring this massacre, they have monuments honoring the white heroes who preserved white supremacy. And this is, to this day, Colfax, it still has these markers, has no actual markers of what actually happened, just have these whitewashed white supremacy markers. So I'm going to play this video about what happened in Wilmington by Box.
For a long time, if you went to the library in Wilmington, North Carolina, there was one thing you weren't allowed to research.
We were refused. We were rejected by the librarian.
When I asked about or inquired about 1898, they wanted to know why.
I was told that, yes, they had something, but they kept it under lock and key.
The story of Wilmington in 1898 still isn't widely known. What happened here on what's now just this empty patch of grass would radically change racial politics in North Carolina. This is the story of an American election. but also of something we don't usually find in American history: the violent overthrow of a democratically elected government. In the late 1800s, Wilmington, North Carolina was the state's largest city. It had a majority Black population, and historians today describe it as a rarity in the post-Civil War American South.
Wilmington, prior to November 1898, was what the New South could be at the cusp of the 20th century.
There was an unusual degree of Black prosperity.
In Wilmington, there were successful Black entrepreneurs, doctors, teachers, but also Black elected officials. And for a time, that was true throughout the state. Take a look at the politicians on this poster of the 1889 North Carolina House of Representatives. Here at the bottom are Black Republican representatives, some from Wilmington. North Carolina also sent 4 Black Republicans to the U.S. Congress between 1875 and 1899. The Democratic and Republican parties of 1898 in many ways occupied opposite parts of the political spectrum than they do today.
Most African Americans were voting for the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party was white voters almost exclusively. White supremacy was the central focus of the platform for the Democratic Party.
Republicans in North Carolina were successful in part because of a third party called the Populist Party, made up of mostly white farmers fed up with the tough economic times. North Carolina populists joined up with Republicans to form what they called the Fusion Party. And in the elections of 1894 and 1896, the Fusion Party defeated the Democrats in sweeping victories statewide. That meant North Carolina now had a government that shared power between Black and white politicians, including a newly elected Republican governor. Together, they moved towards reforms that would favor Black Americans and working-class whites.
This was something that the Democratic Party folks were simply not going to accept.
A multiracial government wasn't just a disappointment for Democrats. It was more like a humiliation. They needed a plan to take back control of the state in the next election. So party leaders like Furnifold Simmons, future U.S. Senator, Charles Aycock, future North Carolina governor, and this man, Alfred Moore Waddell, came up with one: to beat the Fusion Party by luring white populist voters away from their alliance with Black voters. Wilmington, with a large Black population and a local fusion government in power, would be a focus of their campaign. The State Democratic Party Handbook for 1898 laid out their goal: consolidate the white vote by stoking white anger and resentment. It said, "This is a white man's country, and white men must control and govern it." Their most effective tool was the media. One of North Carolina's biggest newspapers was a Democratic Party mouthpiece. It ran racist political cartoons throughout 1898.
Not everybody was literate in 1898, but to see a political cartoon of the type that ran, you may not be able to read it, but you know exactly what it means.
Many of the cartoons were centered on the threat of Negro rule, even though the fusion government was mostly white. They also played up another fear.
Black men threatening white women became a theme. White men need to do all that they can to protect white womanhood.
This was all part of North Carolina Democratic strategy, but it echoed the national racist rhetoric of the time. In one speech that Democrats printed in a Wilmington paper, a prominent Georgia writer named Rebecca Felton said,
"If it takes lynching a Black man a day to protect white womanhood, I say lynch."
Her speech prompted a Wilmington Black man named Alex Manley, owner of the Black-run Daily Record newspaper, to respond with a column. He made a simple observation that, at the time, was shocking.
That white women who had liaisons with Black men did so voluntarily and enthusiastically.
Manley wrote, "Every Negro lynched is called a big, burly Black brute, when in fact, many were sufficiently attractive for white girls to fall in love with them."
Manley pretty much said, In a nutshell, sometimes white women choose to be with black men.
Manly's editorial became another tool for Democrats. Newspapers reprinted it, called it a horrid slander, and ran comments about it on a daily basis. It was just a few months before the election, and white voters were angry.
By the time the election rolls around on November 8th, black voters, Republican voters, had been thoroughly intimidated here.
By all accounts, the elections of 1898 were a sham. The Democratic Party had a paramilitary group called the Red Shirts. They attacked and blocked black residents from voting. At a rally just before the election, Alfred Moore Waddell provoked the crowds. He said, "Negro office holding ought at once and forever be brought to an end, even if we have to choke the current of the Cape Fear River with carcasses." The votes were counted, and the Democrats won.
Democratic candidates won every seat they had a candidate up for election in.
But some local fusionist politicians remained in power because their seats hadn't been up for re-election, like the white Republican mayor and the Board of Aldermen. And of course, the election did nothing to undo the economic power black folks held in the city. The Democrats had won the election, but their goal of total white supremacist control remained out of reach.
And so they engineered what was essentially a coup d'etat.
The day after the election, at a gathering for white men in Wilmington, the Democrats unveiled a document called the White Declaration of Independence. It contained an ultimatum. Cynthia Brown, whose descendants were in Wilmington back in 1898, is a historian at her church where there's a preserved copy of the declaration from the next day's newspaper.
"We will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin."
They would strip black men of voting rights. They would give white men a large part of the employment heretofore given to black men. And as for Alex Manly, "We demand that he leave this city forever within 24 hours. The next morning, hundreds of white men marched to the offices of the Daily Record. Manly was gone. He had fled to save his own life. They set the Daily Record building on fire. This is where it once stood.
Once the white leadership destroyed Alex Manly's printing press, they destroyed one way in which the African American community in Wilmington could organize itself and keep itself informed.
At City Hall, the mayor and Board of Aldermen were forced out.
There's 200 armed men in City Hall at the time. They didn't do it of their own free will. And as they resigned, a new member selected by the Democratic Party was voted into office.
Waddell, who once threatened to fill the Cape Fear River with black bodies, was the new mayor of Wilmington. Meanwhile, the mob had grown to about 2,000 men, and the violence spilled into the streets. In these photos, X's mark where the first black residents were killed.
The stories are that they were dumped into the river, and there are varying stories about how many people were killed.
I see 40 to 60 clearly as fatalities as a result of the violence, but I think it was higher.
Many black residents hid for days in the swamps and the wooded cemeteries in the city, including Cynthia's great-grandmother. And thousands of other residents fled Wilmington, never to return. Shortly afterward, Democrats printed booklets celebrating a glorious victory, and in the newspapers depicted black residents as the instigators.
This image is a gross misrepresentation of what actually happened during 1898. You know, what you see is African American men with guns, not white men with machine guns.
The city never regained its black majority population. Jim Crow laws, like literacy tests and poll taxes that prevented black people from voting, were immediately enacted, and Wilmington's spirit of black opportunity was crushed. Black political representation in the state was over. It would be 90 years until North Carolina elected its next black Congress member.
Wilmington did a really great job of covering up the very dark past for a very long time.
Over the years, the textbooks on North Carolina's history have struggled to accurately describe what happened in 1898. This one from 1933 says the situation was unfortunate for both races. And this one from 1978 doesn't have that much more detail. But they both praise Charles Aycock, a politician who helped perpetrate the riot. They say he had a keen mind and a kind heart, and that, in fact, he was one of the best friends that the colored people had in the state.
All right. So that, I think that just, what happened in Wilmington definitely summarizes what happened. Many different variations of this, but that was a big point of these massacres and these lynchings, was to take back control of governments and power and through violence. And then we saw, another great, another example of a massacre was and what happened in Tulsa, which basically in Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was this prosperous Black neighborhood. It's a thriving Black neighborhood to the point that they called it Black Wall Street because it had a very, very successful, economically successful, segregated Black neighborhood that was surrounded by other white communities. And there was this allegedly there was this Black person that assaulted a white girl, and then from there, white mob gathered around the courthouse to lynch him, and then after that, just went into the Greenwood and basically just destroyed everything and massacred people, to the point that like city officials, police, they even had airplanes that were dropping bombs and shooting on people. It was a massacre. That HBO show. I'll remember it later, but did a really good job capturing just how horrific it was. 35 blocks were destroyed, 9,000 Black people were homeless, through over 300 Black people were killed. And when they say that, these are conservative numbers. There are way more people that were killed than 300, but these were just confirmed. They're actually still looking for mass graves right now. There's still a lot of missing people from this event. And I think most importantly, or not most importantly, but a very important factor was tens of millions of dollars of Black wealth were destroyed, never to come back. And this happened all over the country. All these massacres, that's one the biggest legacies of these massacres, this enormous amount of wealth, Black wealth, was just wiped away, and people had to start all over. At the same time, we start seeing, this is just before redlining, start kicking in, and right in the middle of Jim Crow. So this is a big part of why we see so much Black poverty. I'm gonna play a little bit shorter video from Vox, but just play the first half of this video. I know the last one was a bit long, but talking mainly about the massacre at Tulsa, because I think it's really important that we understand this part of our history.
Something terrible happened here. And for decades, people didn't talk about it.
I was an adult before I ever heard about it. It was something that was hidden.
This entire historic community was obliterated. Bodies dumped in rivers, bodies dumped in mass graves. It was an absolute massacre.
This story isn't one you'll find in most history books. And almost 100 years later, the facts of what exactly happened that day are still unraveling. So we're driving in what's known as Black Wall Street. It's where one of the nation's worst episodes of racial violence took place. In 1921, a neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, called the Greenwood District, was a bustling community of Black-owned businesses. Tulsa locals know that period of Greenwood's history as a kind of golden age.
If you can imagine just an old-time downtown, things like movie theaters, pharmacies, hair salons, and so forth.
They called it Black Wall Street.
It was a mecca. It was a huge success.
But Black Wall Street was also an anomaly. It thrived at a time when the KKK was incredibly active in Oklahoma, and the nation had just been through the Red Summer of 1919, when white mobs murdered Black people in dozens of incidents across the U.S.
There needed to be a sort of match or an igniter tossed on these embers. And that trigger event, was an incident that involved two teenagers, Dick Rowan, 19-year-old black boy, he shined shoes downtown. Sarah Page, 17-year-old white girl who ran an elevator in a downtown building called the Drexel Building. He went to the building, boarded the elevator. Something happened, and Sarah Page began to scream. They both ran out of the elevator.
Now, we don't know exactly what happened in this elevator, but a day later, Rowland was arrested and taken to the courthouse. The local newspaper ran an article claiming Rowland had assaulted Page. Even though Page refused to press charges, the article was essentially a call to action for whites.
A large white mob began to gather on the lawn of the courthouse. Dick Rowland was in jail on the top floor. A number of black men, several dozen, marched down to the courthouse to protect him, some of them armed. There was a struggle between one of the black men in the small group and one of the white men in the larger group, and things sort of went south from that point.
Hundreds of white people descended upon Black Wall Street, armed. Black residents withdrew behind the railroad tracks that marked off the Greenwood district. Some of them were armed and fought back, but they were outnumbered by the white mob, which shot their way through. The white mob murdered, they looted, and they set fire to Black Wall Street.
This was the strategy, if you will, of how to deal with these communities, with these successful black communities. The effects were disastrous.
For 2 days, the Greenwood district burned. Martial law was declared, and the National Guard was brought in. By the time the massacre ended, Greenwood was in ruins. More than 1,200 homes were destroyed, and 35 blocks burned. The exact number of casualties is harder to pin down. Some initially only reported that white people died. Others reported somewhere between 30 and 100 mostly black casualties. But estimates now put that number closer to 300. As for those that survived, thousands of them lived in tent cities in the months that followed, and were left to pick up the pieces of rubble they once called home. After the massacre, the cover-up started. Records went missing from city files, including the very article that started it all. It makes photos from this time all the more important as part of the historical record, but back in 1921, these images served a very different purpose. So photo postcards like these were pretty widely distributed after the massacre. At the time, they were a part of white supremacist culture and kept as souvenirs of racially charged crimes. Now they're preserved to make sure this part of Tulsa's history isn't forgotten, and they paint a clear picture of how much destruction there was that day. On the postcards, it's called the Tulsa Race Riot, a name that itself sort of erases what really happened.
By calling it a riot, it's a way of trying to rewrite the history, assuming that there were both sides at fault, and that was not the case. I call it a massacre, and I call it that because that's what it was.
All right, I really like the last part. We oftentimes, we dumb down our language, right? We call things race riots or racial divides or things like that, and it's yeah, it's something we need to stop. So then. All right, so it wasn't just black people, particularly in the South, that were lynched. I mean, the majority of people lynched during this time period, at least that were recorded, were in the black people in the South, particularly black men. But all across the country, there was lynching happening, particularly, out west, especially as we start expanding our nation out west, as we start capturing, Texas, and with the Mexican-American War, we captured a huge part of Mexican secession. So Texas, this was an annexation of Texas, during, but then we start capturing a whole, part out west, California, all these different states, and the governments, the white governments that that pop up are pretty horrific. We talked a lot about the early Californian governments and the colonialization class, particularly the anti-indigenous, essentially genocide that they're performing. But a lot, there was like tens of thousands of Mexicans that lived in this area, and when this became U.S., a lot of them moved back to Mexico, but some of them stayed because part of the treaty that ended the Mexican-American War, so that any Mexican staying could become a citizen, and the U.S. government swore they would protect their rights, but eventually, we wanted the land for white settlers, and that's when we start seeing a lot of violence, particularly a lot of lynchings as well, particularly towards Mexican Americans, but also a lot of Asian immigrants that arrived. There are a lot of instances of lynching. There was somewhere around 547 cases of documented. Some would argue whether some of these were considered lynching, like the Equal Justice Initiative only considered about 300 of them to be actual lynching. But either way, I mean, these were massacres and murders, and they're pretty horrific, and they were used to instill terror. Whether it was terror amongst the Asian immigrant communities or Latin or the Mexican American communities. And we're going to talk a lot more about all of this during that. We're going to have a whole class on the history of Asian and Latinx history in America, and particularly around discrimination and violence that they experience, which is often other histories that we don't often teach. But a lot of this, occurred, through organizations like the Texas Rangers, which was just like this, like this policing, it was kind of like a Western, first versions of police. So police, emerged, you had the slave patrols that eventually became the new police in the South. And then you had these hired, organizations in the North that were basically used to, as union breakers and to harass immigrants and protect property. But then you see this new policing that emerges in the West, and amazingly, mainly this like Texas Ranger style, where they're supposed, they, even though they're part of the policing, they still committed a lot of lynching, because instead of actually capturing people and taking them back for trials, they would just kill people, and they killed a lot of Mexican Americans. Often it was like there'd be like social transgressions, or there would be like accusations of crime, but a lot of it was just that they wanted the land that the Mexicans own, Mexican Americans own. So they just, they're a brutal organization, and it's pretty awful that we like glorify them with like Chuck Norris shows and things like that. But yeah, just even though this wasn't as big as a Southern Black lynching, I mean, we still saw a lot of lynching across the country as well. And we're really going to dive into these histories, like I said, in another class. We're going to really focus on the Latinx history in the South, and the Asian immigrant history in the West. But yeah. So this is another Francesca Ramsey, who does MTV Dakota. We played a lot of her videos. She's got on her new series, season 8. She does a really great show about the racist origins of police, and she talks about those three things: the Western Texas Rangers, the Southern Slave Patrols, and then the Northern hired I don't know. Group of people that were basically used to bust unions and harass immigrants. But I just want to play the clip really quickly of her about Texas Rangers, because I think it does a good job kind of summarizing their origins.
So up next is the colonialist West. As far back as the 1830s, police entities like the Texas Rangers were on the front lines of the United States' violent expansion westward, working to dispossess land through the brutalization and murder of indigenous populations. There's a reason Walker Texas Ranger was played by a Chuck Norris and not a Chuck Berry. After the Mexican Revolution in 1910, the Texas Rangers grew rapidly until the organization expanded to more than 1,300 officers. Then from 1915 to 1917, Texas Rangers, working with local law enforcement, killed over 100 Mexican residents, rising out of the criminalization of Mexican people near the border. All of this culminated in the 1918 Porvenir Massacre, when the Texas Rangers murdered 15 unarmed locals under the false pretense that they were harboring bandits. One Army official at the time called it wholesale murder, and it caused such a public stir that it prompted state-level legislative hearings into the misconduct of the Rangers throughout Texas. The State House investigation concluded that the Texas Rangers had committed many atrocities and extrajudicial killings, particularly of ethnic Mexicans. And one action the State House took was to reduce the size of the Texas Rangers, which is kind of like an early version of defund the police.
All right. Um, so a big part of what really initiated a lot of this violence, and not only initiated violence, but also like removed any kind of federal oversight for this violence, was the Supreme Court case, United States versus Cruikshank. So going back to Colfax, we talked about Colfax. Massacre a couple of slides ago. Colfax, Louisiana. They were boycotting this the election that was basically stolen by white supremacists. And then all those, so they peaceably occupied the courthouse. A lot of black protesters, and they were all just massacred. And we knew exactly who massacred, and we knew who orchestrated it. All who brought organized the militias, the white supremacist militias, and who did everything. But so this was the time where the federal government was under grant. So we had the enforcement acts, and these enforcement acts gave the federal power, because state powers and local powers, the state governments were doing nothing to prosecute these lynchings and massacres. But the federal government, as soon as they had the enforcement acts, which came along with Grant's administration, they were able to actually start prosecuting, white terrorists, particularly white terrorists that focus on suppressing the black vote. And they, prosecuted hundreds of them, and essentially, destroyed the KKK for a while. But then, so they tried to prosecute the people behind this Colfax, massacre, and ultimately, one of them, sued, or somehow sued back, sued the federal government, Cruikshank, and it went to the Supreme Court. And remember at this time when we talked about the Supreme Court was a huge instrument of white supremacy that dismantled all the Reconstruction amendments and acts, and it was very, very integral on this overthrowing Reconstruction. So it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court just basically deemed that the enforcement acts can only be used, can only be prosecuted against state governments. So the federal government can only prevent and prosecute state governments from committing violence. They can't prosecute individual actors, which is basically all the all the violence that was being perpetuated at the time was individual actors. So the Supreme Court very intentionally basically just dismantled the enforcement acts. And there was like some like 100, there was like over 100 cases that Department of Justice was trying to prosecute, when the Colfax, massacre, they had to let everyone go. Department of Justice dropped 179 Enforcement Act prosecutions in Mississippi alone. So like literally hundreds of these cases of white terrorists that were being prosecuted by the federal government. All of that just, with this one, court case, all of that, they had to drop all of it. And so basically that was the point that the federal government lost any ability outside of the military of directly enforce. They still had the military at the time for another 7 years before that was withdrawn. But the military, could try to prevent massacres, but they couldn't, prosecute people after the fact, and they couldn't be any everywhere that, so these enforcement acts gave the federal government ability to, even if things happen, they could still prosecute and arrest and throw in prison these white terrorists. And after the Supreme Court case, that never happened again. And we see, the federal government basically drops all their prosecution cases, and basically the South is just left at the mercy of the white terrorists. White terrorists have free reign to do whatever they want, especially in 7 years after that. Well, actually, no, I'm sorry, I'm mixing up the dates. So the 1870 was Enforcement Acts, and then this case was 1876. So this is actually 1 year before that the 1877 compromise. So this case happened. The federal government dropped all their federal prosecution cases, and then the next year is the Great Compromise, where Rutherford B. Hayes, becomes president in exchange for removal of the military. So essentially, at this point, there is nothing stopping white terrorists. They have full reign to do whatever they want, because this court case says basically it's up to the state government to prosecute, and say all the judges are basically white supremacists. So that's when we just see this huge uptick of massacres and lynchings and terrorism all over the South for literally like the next century. And this is really important to understand that how the white terrorism and the justice system work together. Even though, like, a lot of these lynchings were done outside of the justice system, they still coordinated and worked with the justice system as well. I really like this quote. Thomas Fortune writes, "The machinery of government gave mobs immunity. Even when law enforcement officers did not actually ride with the Ku Klux Klan or march with the lynch mob themselves, they would not arrest racist killers. A white man charged with killing a black man could count on the grand jury refusing to indict him, the local district attorney refusing to prosecute him, or the jury refusing to convict him. The machinery of justice endorsed mob violence." So a lot of these, law enforcements at the time, I mean, most of them just, looked the other way. They tolerated this stuff, and many times they actually joined in. Like Tulsa, the police actually joined in on shooting and killing, black people. And many of the law enforcements were also members of the White Citizens Council and the Ku Klux Klan and all these other terrorist organizations. So it wasn't, it all was basically one same force. Even though we talk about lynchings was supposed to happen, in mobs, the law enforcement was definitely on board with everything that was happening. And especially what made this also happen is not only was the federal government done, prosecuting, after the Cruikshank case, but essentially during the South, especially after radical Reconstruction during Jim Crow, all the juries were basically white juries, and the judges were white. Even though there was, 1875 Civil Rights Act tried to ban that, it was really easy to find lots of ways to continue doing that. And that's for the next century, basically. No one's prosecuted for lynching, because all the juries are white. It's around 1% of lynchings were ever convicted of a criminal offense at this point. I want to read this last quote from Equal Justice Initiative. "Lynching also directly fostered the racialization of criminality. Whites defended vigilante violence aimed at black people as a necessary tactic of self-preservation to protect property, families, and a Southern way of life from dangerous black criminals. The link between lynching and the image of African Americans as criminal and dangerous was sometimes explicit, such as when lynching occurred in response to allegations of criminal behavior. In other cases, white mobs justified lynching as a preemptive strike against the threat of black violent crime." And that's really important, that a preemptive strike against the threat. So even if there's, nothing's happened, white people assume black people are dangerous, they're going to, lynch to hold that racial boundary. Decades of the racial hierarchy. Decades of racial terror in the American South reflected and reinforced the view that African Americans were dangerous criminals who posed a threat to innocent white citizens. The Civil Rights Act in 1964, a signature legal achievement of civil rights movement, contains provisions designed to eliminate discrimination in voting, education, and employment, but it does not address discrimination in criminal justice. Though the most insidious tool of racial subordination throughout the era of racial terror and its aftermath, the criminal justice system remains the institution in America's life least impacted by the civil rights movement. Similarly, the system's endorsement of racist myths of black criminality has never been meaningfully confronted. The unprecedented level of mass incarceration in America today is a contemporary manifestation of those past distortions and abuses that continues to limit the opportunities of our nation's most vulnerable. So I think that last paragraph just sums it up, just like the connection that we're seeing with the enormous amount of black police brutality against black people today came from this time period, came from these justifications that are used to justify, lynching and white supremacy and white terrorism, which it came from this like black criminality, this where they said that the preemptive strike. That, in other cases, white mobs justified lynching as a preemptive strike against the threat of black violent crimes. And that, we've internalized that generations of black criminality and this threat from black people. And that is what, goes into, even today, the interactions between when black people or when white cops assess, whether, they pull the trigger or not, whether they're in danger or not, it comes directly from our history of racial terrorism. And then, President Roosevelt even wrote, this is Teddy Roosevelt, when everyone was trying to get him to pass lynching laws. He said, when black criminality ceased, lynching would cease. So even he was pushing this idea that this was needed, this lynching was needed to deal with black criminals and black criminality. And only when black people stopped being criminals would lynching stop, happening. So And that, directly translate, like I said, to the internalizations and the fear of Black people that we see today. I really like this. Reverend Tracy Blackman writes, "It's impossible to be unarmed when my Blackness is the weapon you fear." And that is really important. I played this slide during our internalization class during the third class, but I want to replay this because this what Megan Francis is talking about directly links this past history of racial terror to what's happening today with our police.
First, part of the reason the killing of unarmed Blacks continues to happen at an alarming rate is because we haven't properly addressed our long history of racial terror in this country, which has treated Blackness as a proxy for criminality, as a substitute for criminality. Instead, when confronted with kind of these jarring racial injustices, what we like to do is to point to the bad racist apples. We like to individualize the problem and situate it away from us. This is why we're able to make sense of, let's say, a Dylan Roof, the shooter in Charleston, South Carolina, who shot up the Black church and had a white power manifesto. But the problem of contemporary racial violence is not that we have a few kind of racist bad apples. The problem is that the whole apple tree is infected. The problem is that the presumption of dangerousness is tightly bound to race for so many in this country. For police officers to justify the use of deadly force, they have to reasonably believe that their lives are in danger. In all of the high-profile killings of Blacks over the past year, officers attest to feeling under threat. But what does this mean in the context of unarmed citizens? It means that Black skin triggers a heightened sense of threat, a life-threatening sense of threat, that then influences the officer's decision to use deadly force. According to the most recent statistics, 33% of Blacks that have been killed by police were unarmed. But it's not just police that prop up this myth of Black danger. This myth gets reinforced and takes on a truth-like quality through everyday interaction. When a Black man passes and a woman clutches her purse, or when a group of Black friends walk by a car and hear the jarring sound of someone who has just pushed their automatic locks because they are afraid.
All right, I really like how she summarized. I mean, when that split second, when someone's, a cop deems whether they, they need to pull out their gun or not, or pull the trigger, that is, that's not. There's no rational thinking. That's pure instinct. That's pure your body, your fight or flight is going into action, and it's assessing the situation without you even thinking. And part of the internalizations that affect that and make things more dangerous is the fact that we have internalized in this Black criminality for so long in this country that our fight or flight immediately goes to that, whether it's way more times than it would ever do that with any with a white person. And then a really important part of lynching that we also need to understand that there's also of white terrorism is white sexual terrorism, and this is something that we don't talk enough about. There's been a lot, some recent books talk. Danielle McGuire wrote this really great book, At the Dark End of the Street, that just talked about the history of white sexual terrorism and sexual violence, and how the civil rights movement, even Rosa Parks, all rose, from this resistance to this white, terrorism. She has this line that says, "Throughout the Jim Crow era, white men lured Black women and girls away from the home with promises of steady work and better wages, attacked them on the job, abduct them at gunpoint while traveling to or from home, work, or church, rape them as a form of retribution or to enforce rules of racial and economic hierarchy." So we talked a lot about this happening during slavery, in the previous sections, and how, white people would justify this, by, creating this like hypersexual Black woman, it was her fault. White people couldn't resist. That stereotype and this rampant rape, did not end with slavery. And actually, many, ways it became, if you read about a lot of the cases that happened during Jim Crow, a lot of this was in direct result to advancements. It was like a white lash. It's direct result to black advancements. There's a lot of cases where people were raped. Black women were raped, and the white person said they're raping them because of some civil rights act or some desegregation of a school. So it was even became this white lash that was thrown upon black women. And I'll read another line from Daniel McGuire. There's little visual record of interracial rape of black women, save for photographs of them clutching obviously biracial children, which is crazy because thousands of black women were raped during the Jim Crow, and there's very little documentation. You see very little in our history books, and there's very little written. Like Daniel McGuire is one, a handful of people that historians have written about this. She wrote a really important case is the rape of Ressie Taylor. So Taylor was kidnapped and raped by 6 white men in Alabama. And she reported the crime. And at the time, Rosa Parks was actually working with, we talk about Rosa Parks. We don't do justice to Rosa Parks. We talk about she was just a woman random woman that refused to get up, on the bus. But in reality, she was an activist that worked for NAACP for a long time. And she worked really around, fighting this sexual violence that was coming from white people. So she actually helped, NAACP, sent Rosa Parks to help the Ressie Taylor because the police were ignoring her claims, and even and when she was trying to prosecute, she knew exactly who the people were. She was probably trying to prosecute them, and there was not only was the police ignoring, but there was a white lash. Her home was firebombed, and then the sheriff basically ran Rosa Parks out of town. So this, this kind of scenario happened all over the South. Thousands of black women were raped by white men, and very little, there's another quote: between 1940 and 1965, only 10 white men were convicted of raping black women in Mississippi, despite the fact that it happened regularly. So thousands of white men got away with this mass rape. And it's like I said, it was this resistance against this white sexual violence really was like the cornerstone of the roots of our civil rights movements. We sell this idea that that in like the 1954 Montgomery bus boycott, that Martin Luther King and all these guys just came in 54, organized this entire labyrinth method network, organized this massive network, in a matter of a couple weeks, and it was just amazing effort, and like that's true. Like they did a lot of great work, but they didn't organize this network. Rosa Parks and other NAACP people have been organizing these networks in Montgomery, Alabama for decades. They organized this network to confront white sexual violence, and so they were able to tap into this network, and that's really what made the Montgomery bus boycott so effective. It was these networks that Rosa Parks and NAACP were forming against white sexual violence. I'll read this last quote by Daniel McGuire. If you have a slave culture for 100 years, what happens when slavery ends? The culture changed? That was part of the question during this research, and the answer was, of course it didn't. White men were raised to believe that they could do whatever they wanted to do to black women, and there would be no punishment. And when they did whatever they wanted to do, there was usually there usually wasn't a punishment. These are lessons handed down from grandparents to fathers to uncles. They were encouraged to get a black woman for their first sex act so that they could practice. In the 40s, they just picked them up on the side of the road, just like Ressie Taylor. It happened all the time. So we're actually going to dive a little bit deeper into this in another class when we talk about patriarchy and white supremacy and how these two mix. And we'll be talking a lot more about this book and other books. And then we talked a little bit already about the birth of nation, but this is part of this like cover up, this D.W. Griffin, silent film. We talked about that. It showed that clip of just how this horrible lie about how black politicians were, but that was just one section of the 3-hour movie. There's also these sections where black men were raping white women, and then KKK showed up, and they were the saviors, and they were the ones. So they really like it glorified, the KKK and it really demonized Black people as just criminals and rapists. And this movie was like shown all over the country as one, because it was like at its time it was so advanced in the realm of like movie technology that it won all kinds of awards. It was huge. Everyone watched it in this country, and it really cemented this idea that white KKK was actually saviors against Black criminals and rapists. And Wilson, the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, loved it. All 9 Supreme Court justices watched it at different additional showings. Majority of our government, federal government and many of our state governments, were shown this movie. So it really had a horrific impact. But to counter that, counter all these narratives, we start seeing the emergence of this new, these new historians, particularly Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells is just amazing woman. She starts, she gets involved with this anti-lynching movement. She becomes an anti-lynching activist when 3 of her friends are lynched. This was a People's grocery store we talked about a little while ago, where it was a Black, grocery store that was doing better than the white grocery store, so they were lynched to remove economic competition. She got galvanized by this experience and decided to start investigating lynching. Like no one was investigating lynchings. No one was like recording all of this that was happening. So she actually publishes her findings in what's a book called Southern Horrors, and that I think it shocked a lot of people, but it also brought a lot of attention to her. And immediately her like Memphis office was attacked by a white mob, and she was like ran out of Memphis, and she ended up having to move to England for a while, where she helped establish the British Anti-Lynching Society. But part of her findings was that she really countered this idea of this rape myth, that these Black rapists, and she found that majority of these cases had nothing to do with rape, or if it was like interracial, it was like actual consensual relationships, and they were claiming that Black people were raping. But she found most of it of lynching cases really had to come down to a Black person was either challenging white authority or had successfully competed with white businesses or politics. So it was all about maintaining white supremacy. I really love this quote. The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And then so she helps kind of launch this anti-lynching society movement, especially in Britain, but she definitely advocates and comes back in America eventually. But at the same time, we other Black people are starting to organize around this. Particularly the NAACP was almost started in 1908 against different kinds of Black. It was basically it started to not to advocate for civil rights, but to fight against racial attacks and against lynchings and Black massacres. And we start seeing these chapters form all over the country, and they start pushing like federal anti-lynching bills. But again, because of the South, dominated, they called it the Southern Bloc. In the South, nothing could really be passed unless that supported Black civil rights or desegregation or anything like that. So they never were able to pass the anti-lynching bill. The federal legislation introduced over 200 bills, anti-lynching bills, and none of them ever passed. And we're still trying to pass them today. The House just passed a version of it. It's called now like the Emmett Till lynching bill or anti-lynching bill, and the Senate, the Republican-controlled Senate. Which remember at the time parties switched, so the Republicans were basically the Democrats back in this time that were opposing any of this legislation against lynching, and they still do. The Republican Senate still refuses to even talk about this anti-lynching bill. So and then, so this is a picture of Howard students actually, doing protests. NAACP, they organize all kinds of massive, lynching protests and awareness campaigns as well. But it's really like the efforts of Ida B. Wells and NAACP that we know what we know today. And then Equal Justice Initiative kind of, took over those efforts as well. But really, what really ended lynching was the rise of a very racist capital punishment system. So Equal Justice Initiative says perhaps the most important reason lynching declined is that it was replaced by a more palatable form of violence. And that's because, lynching, especially in the 20s, thanks to like NAACP and I.W. Wells, people are starting to, hear about, that maybe lynching isn't, this great thing that protects white women and protects white, the white race. Maybe this is, so it eventually in the early 1900s became less socially acceptable as it got more and more bad press. So that was the time that, eventually in that time period, the capital punishment, court order executions started to outpace lynchings in former slave states for the first time. That was 1915, was the first year that more people were killed by the state than killed by lynch mobs. And that really, kept on going for like, the next, couple of decades, and eventually just replaced lynching altogether. And it was such an unfair and racist, criminal justice system that, it was the same, had the same results, basically. Blacks were only 22% of the South's population between 1910 and 1950, but constituted 75% of those executed in the South during that period. That's not to say that, there was probably some people that, besides the point if you believe in the death penalty or not, let's just assume everyone believes in it. So for this scenario, but there's probably some people that did deserve it, but the vast majority, were people that were just being lynched. They were being lynched by the state government to continue this reign of terror to control the racial hierarchy, and that's ultimately what ends up replacing lynching. Lynching was never like it wasn't the federal anti-lynching bill. It wasn't massive movements. It was basically they just moved lynching indoors into the state, and there's like the same exact results that they're getting. The majority of people that were being executed were Black people, and probably most of them were innocent. They're only their only problem was that they challenged the racial hierarchy and challenged white supremacy. And we see that today, even today, like the data around lynching today, or capital punishment, African Americans make up less than 13% of the nation's population today, but 42% of the people on death row and 34% of those executed since 1976. And then we had this, Supreme Court case in 1987, McCluskey versus Kemp, where there was, it was in Georgia, where a Black man was on death row, and he sued the government and to try to claim that there was an enormous amount of racial bias. And they successfully proved, the SCOTUS, Supreme Court admitted that yes, there was an enormous amount of racial bias in Georgia criminal justice system. You were 22 times more likely to be receive capital punishment if you're Black for the same exact crimes as if you're white. And they recognized that, but they literally said, SCOTUS, they said they held significant risk of racial discrimination did not violate the Constitution. So they basically said, yes, we recognize there's an enormous amount of racial injustice and bias happening, and Black people are being killed disproportionate amount than anyone else, but they said that did not violate the Constitution. So that's and that basically just solidified this whole system. It closed the doors on any kind of reform on racial bias reform in the criminal justice system, and that's important. That's like that. We talked a lot about the history of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has always been, a tool of white supremacy. Not to say they've done some great things as well, and done, but for the most part, it's as long as white people are dominating their government, it's going to be a tool for white people. And we see this. They literally admitted, yes, there's a lot of racial discrimination, but it did not. Racial discrimination doesn't violate our Constitution. So Equal Initiative said capital punishment remains rooted in terror and racial terror, a direct descendant of lynching. So I'm going to play a real quick clip of Bryan Stevenson. He's going to talk a little bit more about the relationship between lynching and capital punishment.
In this country, we have a death penalty that targets people of color. A race of the victim is the greatest predictor of who gets executed in America. The death penalty is lynching's stepchild. We moved lynchings from outside to inside in the 1940s and 50s when the political pressure on these communities that tolerated this spectacle violence got so great that they no longer felt like they could do it with impunity. And so we had these sham trials that didn't last very long, where people were quickly convicted, many of them innocent, wrongly accused. We make all kinds of mistakes with innocent people. For every 9 people we've executed, we've identified one innocent person on death row. And yet, we don't say stop. We don't say wrong. We don't say this is undermining our ability to be a free, just society. We say, let's execute some more. I think that connection is directly linked to what we tolerated during the era of lynching. And we use this threat of lethal violence from an electric chair to replace the threat that was created through hanging. And I don't think it's an accident that the states with the highest lynching rates are the states with the highest execution rates. Nor do I think it's an accident that you see communities in those states that feel deeply burdened by our continuing willingness to kill people in this racialized way.
I think that says a lot. That the community, the states that had the highest levels of lynching are now the ones with the highest level of death penalty and capital punishment. And that says a lot about what the goals of a lot of these systems. So now I want to talk a little bit about the Great Migration, because this is something we talked a little bit already about it before, but we teach the Great Migration as this like great thing that Black people having the freedom to move and find economic opportunity and move around. It's like this almost like how we talk about this like how we whitewash the white settlement of the West and the colonization of the West, and how it was this great adventure. And in reality, it was anything but. I mean, these people were fleeing pure, racial terror, and fleeing really horrible circumstances. I mean, they had to leave in the middle of the night. Many times there was KKK and white terror groups that were hanging around, bus depots and train stations, and to return Black people trying to flee their sharecropping and their horrible situations. And a lot of times, a lot of people got lynched trying to leave. I mean, it was a pretty horrific situation. But eventually, close to 6 million Black Americans did flee the South between 1910 and 1970, particularly around the 2 great wars, World War I and World War II, because that's where enormous amount of economic opportunity rose, where factories were so, needed labor so much they were willing to actually hire non-white people. And Bryan Stevenson says an equal justice initiative. African Americans in these communities did not come as immigrants looking for economic opportunities. They came as refugees, exiles from the lands in the South where they were being terrorized. And those communities had particular needs were never addressed. We never talked about. We've gotten generational poverty in these cities and marginalizations within Black communities, and you cannot understand these present day challenges without understanding the Great Migration and the terror and violence that sent the African Americans to these cities where they've never really been afforded the care and assistance they needed to recover from the terror and trauma. And then they thought because if they could just get to the north or to the west, that because there was no Jim Crow out there, that everything would be fine. What they found was that it was just the same. There was just this horrific racial segregation and racial hierarchy, and they were forced to live in concentrated poverty, with horrible housing and dealing with bad schools and tons of discrimination in the job market, and then they had this racial hierarchy that was basically enforced by police violence. That was one of the main roles of police during this time was to violently enforce a racial hierarchy against these Black people trying to flee the South. So Brenton Mock writes, Northern whites believe African American migrants were criminal by nature, which was a justification for why these cities didn't offer the assistance the new migrants needed. So Bryan Stevenson also writes, we created a narrative of racial difference in this country to sustain slavery, and even people who didn't own slaves bought into this narrative, including people in the North. We were all complicit in the institution of slavery, and the same is true in the era of racial terror and lynching. The North and Congress basically gave up equality for African Americans that set us on the course that we have not yet recovered from. So I'm gonna play this quick, or play I think it's like 5-minute video about Fox, and he's going to give you just a background of what this migration really looked like.
This map shows the Black Belt of the United States. Its name comes from the fertile soil associated with the region. And for most of America's history, more than 90% of the country's largest minority group lived here. Starting in the early 20th century, nearly half of the African American population left this region to resettle in emerging northern and midwestern cities. It was one of the largest internal migrations in U.S. history, and now data indicates that a new movement is taking shape. To understand why, let's go back to 1865. The Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery and started a new era for colored people in the states. Shortly after, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments enfranchised people of color at large. For the first time, the majority of Black Americans controlled their own destinies. In the years immediately following emancipation, most freed slaves chose to stay in their communities. After all, the only America they had known was the South. It was common for their descendants to work as sharecroppers on plantations. Sometimes their only payment was permission to live on the property. But that wasn't the worst aspect of the South for Blacks.
The Jim Crow caste system determined where you could eat, what platform you stood on when you were catching a train. This was a rigid caste system in which any breach of the caste system could literally mean your life.
That's author and journalist Isabel Wilkerson. She spent 15 years compiling the stories of Black exodus to cities in the North, Midwest, and West. The movement would come to be known as the Great Migration.
The Great Migration was really seeking a political asylum within the borders of our own country. Many of them were fleeing for their lives. They were fleeing a caste system, a rigid caste system known as Jim Crow, in which everything that you could and could not do was based on what you looked like.
In 1915, African Americans began to leave the Black Belt for these new industrial centers. By 1929, 1.5 million African Americans had resettled in new northern metro areas. At the time, America's participation in World War I drove demand for manufacturing labor. But strict immigration laws left northern factories with a shortage of workers. Factories in the north started recruiting low-skilled workers from the south. The workers faced discrimination in their new homes, which culminated in the Red Summer of 1919. Migrant Blacks, whites, and European immigrants were all competing for limited housing and resources, which exacerbated relationships in city centers. The most prominent of these settlements for migrating Blacks was New York City, and the art, music, and theater that emerged from this community became known as the Harlem Renaissance. These artistic achievements redefined the cultural image of Blacks in America. But the stock market crash of 1929 and ensuing Great Depression slowed the influx from the South and effectively ended the first migration. The second wave began in the 40s, when in World War II kick-started manufacturing again, while agricultural employment in the South plummeted. Once again, people living in the rural South began to migrate to cities. Manufacturing hubs in the West were far more prominent in this second movement, but only a fraction of skilled labor positions went to African Americans. That kind of discrimination was a common experience for participants in the Great Migration. Throughout history, the segregated neighborhoods that Southern Blacks flocked to often became the ground centers of massive, racially motivated rioting. In most cases, the protesting began in response to perceived unfair treatment of the Black community. This is a trend that continues today, as seen in modern violent protests in Baltimore, Ferguson, and Milwaukee. By the end of the second migration, an estimated 5 to 8 million Blacks had resettled outside of the South.
All right. So that video goes on for a while. If you want to watch what kind of happens next, definitely check out that video. And then another, just a minute long, I just want to add one last video from Bryan Stevenson talking about that Great Migration.
Today we see people leaving countries that are the places where they were born and have lived because there's a threat of violence so great that they can't stay. It's just not rational to stay. That's what happened in America. In the first decades of the 20th century, nearly 6 million African Americans fled from the American South to the North and West. Millions of Black people fled their homes, their land, their families because they weren't safe. And this movement of African Americans from the South to the North and the West represents one of the largest mass migrations in the history of the world. I think it was a forced exodus. It was people being terrorized to the point where they had to flee. This mass movement of people radically changed the American South, but it also radically changed the urban North and West. That movement of people is a story that we need to understand if we want to understand those communities today.
All right. So now we're towards the last part, a couple of slides. We're going to talk kind of like the legacy of lynching. We already talked a lot already about this, but I mean, the direct result was like thousands of dead, terrorized, even hundreds of thousands of terrorized Black communities, millions of refugees, fleeing the South, trying to find a better life, and then, but instead, arriving into communities that were so pumped full of this same justification, this Black criminality that was being used to lynch people, that they themselves became, oppressors of these people, arriving to the cities. And so we see, the direct result is we just see, how, even like today, like things like racial wealth gaps and disparities in health, all of this can be linked to the fact that we never actually helped these people, during this massive lynching era. And at the same time, lynching maintained this white supremacy, they maintained, the rationalization, but maintaining white supremacy through, terrorism by, creating this Black criminality myths, and that is permeated to, to every aspect of our society, from policing to the way white teachers treat Black students, to how you treat Black, customers, in department stores, and it's just, it's something that we're still dealing with today. At the same time, all these people, because most of these lynchings were these public events. So like we talked, like whites participated, witnessed, socialized children in this culture of violence were psychologically damaged. So these children that were taken to these lynchings and had to watch, Black people be tortured to death. These are ones that, that taught Southern kids, children to accept and embrace racial violence. So this was happening, and as children grow up, and then they're the ones that are committing violence against, desegregation efforts. They're the ones that are, become the new generation of white supremacists in the South, and then that just passes on generation to generation, and it's reinforced by these public and private institutions that memorialize the Confederacies. And instead of talking about lynching and having memorials around lynching, in towns that committed lynching, we instead have all these memorials, Confederacy memorials, and then we talk about how great the Confederacy was and how Black people, terrorized, were actually the oppressors during the Reconstruction era. And it's just like, it creates these narratives that just fuels more white terrorism and more white supremacy, even today. So I read this last quote: narratives emerged after lynching era that blame lynching on the minorities of Southern white extremists, but reports of the day clearly demonstrated that participation in lynching was widespread among Southern whites. Lynchers tended to be ordinary and respectable people animated by a self-righteousness that justified their atrocities in the name of maintaining the social order and racial order from all white people benefited from. So this wasn't just, again, we like to dumb down, oh, this is just a bunch of ignorant, dumb racists, a small minority, but this, in reality, this was when the majority that was a part of the system. Even if they weren't doing the torturing and murdering, they were still part of this. They were still witnessing. They were still benefiting from it. So I'm gonna read another real quick 1 minute long Bryan Stevenson video.
In Berlin today, you can't go 100 meters without seeing a marker or a stone that's been placed next to the home of a Jewish family that was abducted during the Holocaust. The Germans want you to go to the Holocaust Memorial because they want to express their awareness that something horrific happened and that it can never happen again. The Germans want to stand with Jews and say, never again. We have a 9/11 memorial in the United States. It took us less than 15 years to build that memorial. I think it's important. I think it's necessary that we memorialize and concretize what happened on that dreadful day. But it speaks to me about what we haven't done for the thousands of lynchings that defined a generation of people. We don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation. We have to own up to the fact that there are places in this country where humans were trafficked, where there were slave auctions. We have to acknowledge the places, we have to recognize the places where terror lynchings took place. There aren't places you can go in this country and be confronted with the history of racial terror and violence and walk out and say, never again. And because nobody says never again, what we see happening is, well, it happening again. And so we have to do that truth-telling work. And then when we tell the truth, only when we've told the truth, can we begin the hard part of repair.
that's really what I mean. That the idea of telling the truth, to start, reconciling, and that's what was a big push for why the Equal Justice Initiative created the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which opened last year in 2019 in Montgomery, Alabama. A lot of people call it the Lynching Museum. There's a huge memorial around lynching, but it's also about slavery and mass and rise of mass incarceration and a lot of the legacies around all this. And it's such important, to have these memorials and to have like public acknowledgments and to have curriculum like 1619 that talks about these things. Because I mean, honestly, a lot of this history is just a handful of people that's keeping these histories alive, and it's really, important that we, if we're going to move on and understand our realities and make it better, we have to understand our history. And Maya Angelou talks about history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And that's unfortunately the problem is we're living this over and over again. We're seeing a rise in white terrorism, a rise in white violence, a rise in solidification of white supremacy in our institutions, and that's because we're not acknowledging the past of this. White supremacy is the most powerful when we don't know that it exists. And right now, majority of white Americans, even though they live in the countries founded on white supremacy, don't understand what white supremacy is. Memorials to things like lynching is a great way to actually educate people. And then I've talked about like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So this is something, these are really powerful commissions, like South Africa after the apartheid, in the 80s when they removed their apartheid government, who committed horrible atrocities to Black people. They had these truth and reconciliation commissions where the white people who perpetuated had to listen to these bystanders and listen to what they actually did and actually acknowledge it. And the whole goal of this isn't like it's about creating a world where everyone can come together and move forward together and live, instead of this continuation of like trying to whitewash things and watching the violence reoccur over and over again. It's a really powerful thing to think about doing that actually. Around lynching and around slavery would be a powerful thing to have in this country. And if you want to learn more about lynching too, Equal Justice Initiative did an amazing. It's like 20 pages. You can read it in like maybe an hour or two. It's called Lynching in America. It's a really powerful document, and it's basically covers everything that we just talked about and so much more as well. So I'm going to leave this last slide of this lynching, of the lynching and white terrorism section. I'm going to leave with Sybil Dunnigan. She wrote a poem after she visited the National Memorial for Peace and Justice Museum that we just talked about.
Freed from the attics of your history, you will find me at this memorial for peace and justice. Once shrouded in the shadows of shame and bigotry, I'm now drenched in the truth of sunlight, but will you hear me? Near a river that once shipped men and women in bondage, you'll see how hate first shackled and chained me and dragged my ancestry across the sea. Agony washed across my face as humanity, stolen from our land, was snatched from our arms. I became a commodity to the economy, 3/5 of a person. Even I condone me. Although I was emancipated, the violence reincarnated into this hunger of racial terrorism. It imprisoned all of those who looked like me with fear. The victims' names are inscribed in 800 columns. Written across these walls are their stories about how they made caricatures of our character based on our skin color. When we said we were innocent, they called us criminals. 2 Black teens accused by a white girl of being threatening were lynched together. When we voiced injustices, they strung us high to die. A wife was hanged with her unborn child for questioning her husband's hanging. I am those teens. That family is me too, and we are more than 4,400 lives who are lynched, shot, and burned alive. But due to your silence, the violence didn't die. It evolved. We were dehumanized by Jim Crow laws and policies, but we marched against the calls of white supremacy because we heard our calls to press on against injustice and to honor our bodies. My history is your history. My blood fed this soil. 6-foot-long monuments as bronze as my skin lay on the ground waiting to be claimed by the counties where these atrocities occurred. The rough surfaces are engraved with the names of those victimized in the violence we have not recognized until now. I know I am hard to listen to, but we cannot heal as a country if we don't recognize the wound. Otherwise, we will continue down this road of demise, and the violence will continue to thrive in the silence.